Well, it's a good evening from a catamaran parked outside Dunk Island, one of the resorts in Queensland that was hit by the global financial crisis, but also Cyclone Yazi. So it's a real desolate, but they're trying to rebuild it. Anyway, so as we make our journey from the Gold Coast to Darwin, we have in our Thursday night shows live, and of course, Andrena's in the UK, and our gentleman today is also from the UK, born there, I should say, but spent the last decades and decades, 2 centuries in Brisbane, and it's a fantastic story. And it's been a long time since I've met Lionel, and to continue it on tonight, it's going to be awesome. He's got a fantastic story. So without further ado, Andrena, I'll pass you on to you, and we'll go from there.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Good day, good morning. Welcome, everybody. If you're listening to Dreaming the New Dream, and if you're new or you're listening to a replay. So it's with great pleasure today that we have Lionel Fifield on the show. So welcome, Lionel, and it's lovely to have you on.
Thank you very much.
So I have been to the Relaxation Centre when I lived in Australia a long time ago, it seems like now. But anyway, you were running the Relaxation Centre for 52 years. And I think reading through your bio, your illness was your gift into running the Relaxation Centre and looking for different ways.
Very much
so.
Yep.
Yeah, so I'd love for you to share your story right from the beginning, because I know you were born in the UK and you shared about being under the sand in the war zone. So would you like to start from the very beginning?
Well, from the very beginning, I was born just at the beginning of the Second World War in the south of England. And then after 6 months, my father decided to take us all back to London. And there I lived underneath a sand pit in a shelter he created. And so I climbed through that period, and I came through into my teens, and I was a very nervous child. My mother always used to introduce me to people as very nervy little boy, she used to say. And so I began to recognize, well, that's who I was, a very nervy little boy. And then my father was more and more disappointed how I didn't turn into the genius he hoped for at school, and really struggled, so full of anxiety, and always feeling second to everybody else. Feeling I had, always comparing myself unfavorably. And then when I left school, I hadn't got very good pass marks, but I managed to scrape enough points together to take up being an accountant. And then when I was, 22 at the time, I just suddenly became clear as I was coming to 23. I became really clear that England wasn't where I had to live. I had to go to Australia, and much to everybody's absolute amazement. Mm-hmm. And I came over here on the Southern Cross, took 6 weeks, and had a really beautiful journey, going to many countries. And then I came into Brisbane, and the moment I came into Brisbane, I felt something very special in my stomach. It felt this was the home I was meant to be at. And then, as my recent book has said, I attempted all sorts of ways to go to other places like Adelaide and Perth to live for a while. And every time I tried, I got blocked. It always was blocking me. And but when I first came over, I went into Melbourne, and I got a job in Melbourne. I always remember I went along to for the labour market and said, I was all dressed up nicely from London, and I went there. And I said I was looking for a job, and perhaps I could do some fruit picking or something of that sort. And the guy said, "Geez, mate," he said, "if we send you off with this lot, you have a knife in your back in no time." So I said, "We can get you a job for 6 months, probably in an accounting company, and you can work it from there." So that's what happened. And then I was suddenly surprised when this chief partner called me and he said, "We'd like you to go to Brisbane, and we'd like you to send us a report every week about how they're going there and how the auditing is being done." So that's what happened. I came up to Brisbane, but just before I did, they asked me if I could give a short talk to a few people. Well, when I said I was nervous, I was terrified of anything like public speaking, and even 4 people would be enough to really make me feel full of panic and fear. And so I thought, I've got to do something about this. I must find somebody who can help me. So they sent me up to Brisbane, and the place I was coming to was the office for that organisation from Australia, from Melbourne. And they, I'll never forget this. I climbed up these 6 flights of stairs to come to the top, 6 floors. And just on the way down, there was Carnegie, Dale Carnegie's office, and saying that we teach public speaking here. And so really the whole of my life seems to have been set before me. Always what I needed was just there. And a lot of the stuff I've written is just a remarkable connection we have with life and everything that we need to do. And so I did there was a 3-month course. It had started the previous week, and they asked me if I'd like to get into it, and I said I certainly would. And it finished the week I left and came, and then went over to New Zealand, and where I thought it'd be wonderful to go and have a look at in fact, the whole way it worked, I decided to go for a swim at one of the big swimming pools, and always had an eye for a pretty girl. And I was sitting at the top seat, and I looked down, and there was a really beautiful girl at the bottom, on the bottom row. And I decided to myself, I must go down and have a chat to her. And so I'd learnt a lot about chatting to girls, and Mr. Charming came out, and I came down and I said, "Do you mind if I have a chat to you?" And she said, "No, I would really love that. That sounds lovely." And she said, "What are you doing now?" And I said, "Well, I think I'll be going to Perth or Adelaide now, and then I'll come back and I'll go to New Zealand." And she said, "Oh, no. This is the time you've got to go to New Zealand." So the next day I was on the ship, or 2 days later I was on the ship going to New Zealand. And there I did about 25 different jobs in the working in sulfuric acid factory. I was making boxes. I worked on the docks, moving all sorts of big bags. I just endless jobs I did in New Zealand, all in 5 months. And then I got this note. I never knew how he got into it, from that man back in the senior partner back in Brisbane, saying that a huge organisation was going into receivership and maybe liquidation for some of the companies, because there were so many companies in the group, and said, could I possibly come and look after that? Well, there I was one day working on the wharves and doing things like that in scrappy old clothes and dirt and so on. And then I hopped on the boat, came back, and then 2 days later, there I was, all dressed up, looking very smart, etc., sitting at the table of 2 of the companies and leading it from there on. So for a man still in my 23rd year, it was quite an amazing experience in every way.
Well, you certainly done a lot in that short space of time, eh?
Yeah. So it was an amazing journey, and anyhow, that's what happened. And then they asked me to stay there it worked out for about 15 months. And I promised my mother I would definitely go back to England before I settled in Australia. So I went back to England, and I went straight to Australia House, and I said, look, I'm an Australian to the core, and I need to get back there as soon as possible. And they sent me straight around to one of the agencies, and I came in on a certain day, and exactly 6 months later, they had to leave you in the country for 6 months before they could send you back, as you came as a 10-pound pom coming back. And that's what I did. I went there, and they got me then on a flight, which was my first big flight back to Australia. And I remember coming into Darwin and the absolute heat of it, and coming out of cold London at the time. So yes, it was quite a remarkable thing. But as I said, before leaving England, what had happened was, before leaving Brisbane, what had happened was I went to this Carnegie organisation and started learning more about the art of public speaking. And then they had these meetings afterwards of the people in those classes. And I got very intrigued with all that. And yet I thought to myself, must be still a better way. I felt there was one man used to hog everything. And again, a wonderful thing, a man, he was just 70 at the time. He was in the group, and he said, we were having a meal together, and he said, you meet me at this room at the Canberra Hotel at that time. You meet me on Monday at 6 o'clock, and I'll show you something that's going to mean it. And that's where I met Toastmasters. And Toastmasters just really intrigued me. I realized how nervous I still was, and I still had to really work on all that. But again, I was very surprised how within 6 months, they asked me if I would be the vice president.
Right.
And then suddenly, within another 6 months, they said, would I be the president? And I couldn't believe it. There was me, this young whippersnapper, and there I was. And there were all these people who were heads of companies and so on, all learning their public speaking as well. And so suddenly there I was as the president of Toastmasters. And that led me on in time to being the district governor and so on. So I learned a great deal. But more than anything, I decided I must start teaching public speaking, because people were saying to me, there were only about 2 Toastmaster clubs at the time, but people kept saying to me, oh, I'm terrified of public speaking. Oh, dear, I don't know how you do it. And I was thinking, little did they know that for me, for years, I couldn't eat for 3 days before the potential talk. Even in Toastmasters, I just couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. I was so terrified of what might happen. And of course, more and more people thought I must be really good. And they started asking me to speak at their weddings. And I can still remember standing at the back in various weddings and absolute sweating of fear, thinking I would have to speak in front of all those people. Some looked very intelligent. Some looked remarkable people. Some looked like great businessmen or politicians. And I was terrified. And anyway, I seemed as though I came out with words that gave people plenty to laugh. And one thing I have found is that there's a real inventiveness in me where I could make people laugh, and they'd come up afterwards and say, I really love that, Lionel, well done. And I thought, little would you know what I've been through leading up to it. So anyhow, that's what happened. And then, so I ran quite a number of these classes. And then I thought, well, perhaps I'll gather some of these people together and from the Carnegie and put them into Toastmaster clubs. And that led me on to actually starting 15 Toastmaster clubs, and also the first Toastmistress club of Queensland. So that was a great thing. but something very funny, which I'll never forget, happened, and that was we had to register our 14, whatever, I think it was 20 people we had to have. We had to register them with the world headquarters, and because I'd had all these women had joined as well, not just men, and we sent the names over to America. I remember this letter that came back, and it said, "Oh, excuse me, Lionel, but we are very surprised. We've never had men with a name like Mary or Julia, or and so said, of course we can't have women in the group because they're not allowed." So I came back to the group, and I this first group, I said to them, "We can't have you in there, but what can we do?" And so Mary said, "Well, I've always wanted to be Michael."
Yeah.
And Louise said, "I think I'll be Louis." And so the 15 women in the group all changed to men's names. And so we sent that off to America, and lo and behold, they all became the very first women members of Toastmasters. And I thought, you're a tricky old fella, you know? And it was full of fun and laughter, and we laughed. But then about 2 years later, I knew it had to happen, because I've always been such a, well, I can't say always, but after my teens and gradually getting out into the world, I knew that women had to move into a level of equality in everything. And so I've worked on that ever since, basically. And so it was very interesting, because those women who were the first ones who had to register as men were able to take in sort of quite major positions in Toastmasters very quickly back in Brisbane. And it wasn't that long before we had a woman, because they all re-registered their names. They'd all had the necessary training and all the experience from Toastmasters. And it was interesting just to see how they all got on. We had, wasn't long before we had our first district governor woman, and certainly many presidents of clubs. So that's all the things that really brought me great joy. But then I knew, as I got up towards the into my 30s, that I had to leave this. But then something of enormous significance happened. And what you brought up before was that I suddenly got sicker and sicker and sicker. I became yellow. People used to say that when I held my hands up, it was like looking at two suns. They were so yellow. Wow. And I felt, I couldn't go to the toilet, etc. I was just really blocked in every way, and just felt sick all the time, had all the pains in my belly. And so I ended up by going to some specialists, and they took all these x-rays of me, and I can still remember them now. Here I was at 32, and I can still remember them looking at these screenshots and so on. And they looked and they said, "Well, within 2 years, you'll have to have this lump of your bowel out, and then we'd have to follow up with that one. That will almost certainly turn into cancer, and then this could happen after that." And they came up with all these different things. And I was certainly, can't say I was too excited about what I was hearing. And anyhow, I went to her and so they said, "We don't think you'll live beyond 40. So be prepared for that." So here I'm now 85. So it's been an interesting journey, but I certainly then had to discover this thing called relaxation. And I also learned how important it was for me to take full responsibility for my life and say, I am responsible. I'm responsible for what goes into my mouth. I'm responsible for how I treat my body. I am responsible for all these different things. And one of the greatest things I realized was in learning relaxation, and that was to say, I am responsible for my life. And if ever I've needed to go to other doctors, I'm not against doctors, don't hear me say that clearly. But if ever I go to a doctor I haven't been to before, what I usually say to them, I should tell you right at the beginning that I'm responsible for my health and not you. But I'd love to hear what you have to say, and then I'll work out whether I do that or not. And I remember, yeah. So I remember after getting home from that first very happy description of what was happening inside me, I can still remember I had this vivid dream that night, and there I was in my mother's kitchen. We went to the cupboard there, and there was a cow, and on top of the cow was a pig. On top of the pig was a sheep. On top of the sheep was some, I think it was chickens, but the whole larder there was absolutely packed with all this stuff. And I realized that my body, nothing was coming out of my body. It was all so packed with meat. And when I was a little boy, I'd never wanted to eat meat. And my mother kept sending me to people like good footballers, etc. And they'd all say to me, Lionel, unless you eat meat, you'll never be a good footballer. You'll never be able to do this. You'll never be able to do that. And I used to say to my mother, as a little boy, I used to say, does this grow on trees? And my mother said, oh, it certainly does. You know, she'd be feeding me with lamb and she'd be feeding me with beef and saying it all grows on trees. She was a good woman, but she thought some nice lies would be valuable for me. And so in the end, I just got completely stuffed up with all this stuff, and that's where I had. And then I started giving myself enemas. I had this particular thing, and putting it bluntly, I used to shove this water in my own backside and clean myself out. And I used to do that 3 times a week, and gradually things began to clear and so on. And what was diverticulitis doesn't go quickly, but it was certainly something that I just had to keep working on. And at that time, I immediately gave up any form of alcohol. I used to love my alcohol before that. So I gave up all sorts of things, which I just knew. I gave up coffee. I just knew these were not things that were right for me. So my gut feeling was telling me much about how to fix my gut up. And so that was a tremendous thing happening. And then again, it was that same old fella who I met, and he said, come along with me. And well, it was he actually introduced me to the whole concept then of relaxation. And so there I was in going to a thing called Mind Dynamics, and which was, you know, pretty popular around the place and opening up all sorts of doors. It was coming from America, and was something that I found very, very interesting. And I just took to it like often they say, like a duck to water. It was just had every meaning for me. And at the end of the first course, where they used to have a group of people meet afterwards, they said to me, could you actually run the group for people having done the course? And I said, well, didn't I? And I was surprised what came out of me of what I seemed to know and how I could run those courses. And so that's where we went. At the end of 3 months, I was called in by the people who gave the courses, and they said, we've got something very serious to tell you. The whole of the organisation is going bankrupt here in Australia. The person who has been owning it, he's gone bankrupt. And he said, we haven't paid lease here for, I think it was 10 months. We haven't paid the rent for 8 months. And we haven't paid the woman who's been the receptionist here. We haven't paid her for 8 months. And what would you suggest? And so I called some other people together who are very keen on the whole concept. And I said, we've got something to do. I said, this has got some really good things in it. Under no circumstances do I want to see this go off with a bad flavour. And they all agreed. And I said, righto, then what I want to do is suggest to those of you, and there were two particular people, I said, those of you who have the capacity to give talks, you join me, and we'll have three of us who will give talks. One of them, who was a really great speaker, his name was Bert, and he used to give these talks over many, many weeks, and changed the lives of so many people. And in that, they were going to be learning how to relax. They were beginning to learn that they were responsible for their health, and that's something so important. And one of the key things we needed to get people to understand is that change is the great stressor of life. Every time there's change in our life, we stress. So even if we're getting married, we can get really stressed. If we change a job, we can get really stressed. You know, all these different things of change will bring us stress, and then we've got to find our way through them. So this takes us to something else which I find is so important, and that is, instead of being owned by our intellect, we realize inside ourselves we've got intuition. And once we can really relax, and once we learn to relax, we start to hear more what we know inside ourselves. And I think for the future, intuition is going to be a key to life, because then we know what to do, where to go, things to come up with. We become more creative, more inventive, and so on. It all comes flowing out of us. And that always sort of fascinated me when I realized the word education comes from the Latin educare. And that word means to lead out of people, not to force lots of information into them. And I thought, wow, that says it all. And I always remember when I was at school, I used to put my hand up, and I was such a nervous kid. I used to put my hand up and say, why are we learning this? What use is this going to be? And they used to say, be quiet, Fifield. I was at this good school in London, and they all spoke like that. And they said, they said, be quiet, Lionel. This is going to be good for you. And just like the meat and everything, it went straight against the grain, you know. So that's where I was with all that. And so we worked away this little group of people, and we were gradually bringing in money, and gradually coming up. And it was really interesting to see that we were paying off the rent, and we were paying off this leasing. We paid this woman who worked there. And as I said to them, I do not want this to go out with a bad smell, because this has got some really good, wonderful information in. And once people can learn to relax, and bear in mind, at that time, there was hardly a doctor anywhere in Australia or anywhere who really saw the benefits of relaxation. It just wasn't there. And often doctors used to shrug their shoulders and say that would make any difference. And all the little ways that we can learn to relax. I think one of the greatest things we can learn to do is to put our feet flat on the ground and be able to really focus on those feet. Because, you know, the opposite is when we're running or we're fighting or whatever, and our feet are not then on the ground. You get your feet flat on the ground, you're actually doing something which actually goes, as I learned years ago, the information then goes right the way through the body to every muscle, etc. And so really important to that thing. And one of the things that people have been really amazed about is the fact that I've had 10 teeth out without anaesthetic.
Wow.
And they always find that quite amazing. And it took me a while before I found a dentist who was prepared to take my first molar tooth out without an anaesthetic. And the only reason he would do that was because he also had heard Dr. Ainsley Mears from Melbourne, who was I always say he was the father of dealing with stress and relaxation, and he wrote the book Relief Without Drugs, and he'd had a tooth out without anaesthetic. And so for me, that was a really amazing experience. And people say, well, how did you do that? Well, you just got to get your attitude right, got to work right with it. And if anyone wants to know, I'm always very happy to share what to do. But the most important thing is you're not there resisting the dentist, you're there flowing with it. And I used to always very basically, I used to say to those teeth, thank you for all you've done for me, but it's now time for you to go.
Yeah.
And I'm just letting you go now. And one of my most popular courses over the years has been Release and Let Go, because that's such a vital part of our lives. The more we're holding on, the more we're fighting, the more we're resisting, the more troubles we have. So, so all this happened. So then I had the next stage of life. There's been a lot happened. It's very nice of you just to let me talk like this.
No, it's fascinating.
Hope it's all coming out all right. So anyhow, when I was 74, I still wasn't fully healthy, but I was certainly beginning to feel there was something ahead for me. And I thought I would go back to England and see my family over there. And one morning I was meditating and thinking about going back, and clear as a bell I had, you're not going to see them, you're going to see this place, Findhorn in Scotland. Mm-hmm. And Findhorn was this remarkable place started by 3 people, and it started on a caravan park in the north of Scotland. And in the most unusual circumstances, you could never say how difficult the circumstances were, they grew the most remarkable things like 60-pound cabbages and things that should never have grown in that area. And that fascinated me, and I couldn't wait to go and see it all. And, all the things where different scientists had come and analysed the soil, analysed everything else, and said it's beyond them how this was possible. But that visit of 10 days to Findhorn just really opened up my life in a whole different way. And I just knew when I was there, again, I was getting this such strong clarity. And I knew that when I came back to Australia, I'd have to stop the stuff with Mind Dynamics that we were running. We'd have to close that. So I came back and I called a meeting of these people. There were 7 of us all together. And I said that I knew it was time to close. And they all looked at me and said, so what do we do from here? And then I left it for 2 seconds and I said, we start our own centre. And that was the start of the Relaxation Centre. And so that was 52 years ago. And we've gone on from there. And it's been a remarkable journey. I remember we had the very first time somebody from overseas contacted me and said, we've heard you're running a centre there, could we come and give a talk? And from there on, I've had some of the greatest speakers in the world come to the Relaxation Centre. And one of the things I'll always forget, because I think all these things are so important, was sitting there and I said to the what we called the core group. There was like a little group of people who were meant to be managing it, and with me as the coordinator of it all. I said, we've got this speaker coming over, and they said to me, oh, will we be who's paying for the airfares? And I said, well, we pay for those. Well, what about accommodation? I said, oh, yeah, we have to look after that. And I can still remember, all of a sudden, we broke out into all this conversation about how much it would cost, etc. And I can still remember there was this, somebody said, but you're going to bankrupt the Relaxation Centre. This is a lot of money. And it was there, I'll never forget, I banged my fist on the table and I said, well, you listen to me right now, because I'm responsible for this. I'll look after the costs, but this person's got to come. And nobody ever questioned it again from there on. For the whole 52 years, we brought on all these speakers from all over the world, and something like, I reckon it's about 240 overseas speakers, and speakers from all over Australia. They've all come there, and we've just had the most marvellous speakers. At the same time, in my becoming an international speaker, and that all came out of going to Findhorn. They asked me to speak at what's called the One Earth Gathering in 1979, and I spoke there, and there were about 500 people from all over the world listening. And again, I got back to Australia, and then I started getting letter after letter from all over the place. You know, that was England, Wales, Scotland, Ireland. I got them from USA, Canada, and New Zealand. I got so many people wanting me to go and speak there and talk about what I was doing. A lot of at that time was talking about prosperity, and that work comes from prospero, which means according to your hope. That's where it all comes from. And so I often say it's according to how your mind is working with you, as opposed to how your mind is working against you. Mm. And one of the things that I've done, which I've had many major speakers say to me, it's not possible. I've done everything all over the world purely on donation. I've always said, no, don't set a fee. I'll come, we'll have a donation box there, and I don't want anybody being told what to pay. There will be some who will leave donations, there will be some that won't. But in that way, I know I can speak to everybody, whatever their financial situation. And boy, have I had some miracle stories connected with that one. And, my book, which I put out this book just a little time ago. And it's about our partnership with life, which really is what I'm fascinated with. And it's like the journey of the Relaxation Centre. And I'm so know that we are all so connected, and everything is connected. One of the things that I've become absolutely fascinated with, which taking that action of going by donation has shown me. I remember, I think I went, one of the places I was asked to go was Norfolk Island. And the person who asked me said, you'll have to charge a fee if you're coming here. And I said, no, I won't. I do everything by donation. I remember she said to me, well, they just don't know what donations are. You won't get much. And at the end of the visit, they had the hall to pay, etc. And so there was absolutely nothing left for me. And this woman said to me, how much was the fare? And I said, $390. And she said, so what are you going to do? What's your wife going to say when you get back? And I said, well, she's used to it now, because this is what I've been doing for years. And I came back, and there the next day there was an envelope came in, and it was from a person. I think it was somewhere like up near it was certainly North Queensland, and she said, you came up here 2 years ago, and you said a whole lot of things that so touched my life. I'm now doing business as I wanted to. I'm now doing this and so on. So many wonderful things have happened to me, and I follow all your advice. And they said, all we can say is thank you. Please accept this donation. And as you might imagine, it was $390.
Wow, that's incredible.
And I look at those things and say, how impossible is that? You know? Mm-hmm. And I've come back before now. I won't go into all the detail, but because it brings in, but certainly I've come back, and there's been some major expense that was loomed up for my house. And I had a woman in Adelaide who used to say, do you mind if I count the donations? And she used to come in every time and say, that is amazing. you have 150 people, and there are some have given you like $100, others have given you 1 cent almost, and said it all averages to $5 almost exactly every time. And I say, yeah, it's pretty amazing, isn't it? And then one time I was down there and she came running, she said, it's amazing, Lionel. I don't know if you got through to the people of Adelaide, but they've left all this money for you today. And I said, really? That's very interesting. And she said, oh, it's amazing. I've counted it up. There's $320 more than I would expect at the average of $5. So she said, do you think you've got through to them now and miracles are now going to happen? And I said, no, every life is a miracle. I got back to Brisbane and I remember my wife saying this particular situation had occurred, and it was very unfortunate because they just had somebody, a technician had come in and he said it would cost $320. And so, you know, I look at all these things and think, miracle, miracle, miracle. How does it happen? And I got a bit nervous about telling people because I don't know whether people. It's my experience, and that's the all important thing. I know in my heart that it's very different from people hearing too many of that type of story for them to truly believe it, because it would all seem fancy. And so this is where I've been careful about not telling too many of the stories, but in my book I've put a few in there because really they're so extraordinary. And and I often say that we can talk about faith and so on, but faith is not something you can read about. It's something you've got to face your fears on, and it's and of course I realised from my background I should have been known as Mr. Fearfield rather than Mr. Fifield, you see, and I've loved the idea of, as I've got older, to be Mr. Faithfield and more Mr. Fulfield, with all these possibilities and the joy I've had from it all. And it's in actually living it that one is more able to pass stuff on to other people. And but the good thing about when I came back from one of the things that keep seeing people write and say, could I speak at the centre? Could I speak there? Could I do this? And I can honestly say I've never gone around looking to speak anywhere. I've just had all these different requests from places saying, could you come and visit us? And I've thought just how marvellous that is too. It's just like they've come out the blue, and all over the UK I've spoken. There's so many cities there. Since 1979 of that One Earth gathering, I did 40 years of twice a year going over to speak in the UK. I've spoken in just all the major cities and all over the place, from the north of Scotland right down to the tip of Cornwall, and right over everywhere. And it's just been such a wonderful, fulfilling life being able to see all these places. And I've been across to France and Italy, and Switzerland was a big one. They kept inviting me back there, and New Zealand, all around New Zealand, and USA, Canada. And it's been a very interesting life I've had, being able to go to all these places. And I've loved it and felt so very fortunate the way it's all been looked after and paid for. And the other thing too, we run the whole Relaxation Centre on volunteers. There's only ever been maybe 3, maybe 4 people who do quite a lot of work there, but nobody gets a normal salary. And I've always made sure that my salary was always a very, very tiny one I ever took there. And not as a mark of poverty, but as a mark of knowing that somehow or other things will work. And and not being a wealthy person taking a lot of money and having all those volunteers working with me, I wanted everybody to feel a sign of equality together. And so that's worked marvelous. And over the years, many volunteer coordinators said, "Oh, Lionel, I'm really worried that we could be getting a bit low on volunteers." I always said to them, hear me, and put it into your mind. We will always have enough volunteers. And over 52 years, it's always been enough to have come in. And sometimes even at the last minute, somebody's just shown up and said, "I just want to volunteer here. When can I start?" And so, yeah, it's been a great journey in that way too, because it's, faith and working with life is in every aspect, and it's just trying to get the. And the other thing I'm very passionate about too, and that is honesty. I mean, I used to hear all about this stuff called honesty, and I think, well, sounds very interesting. And then I used to hear honesty is the doorway to heaven. Honesty is the doorway to discovery, and so on. And I began to realise how few people could truly be honest, even with the closest people in their lives. And it's not an easy thing to do. But if we're going to learn honesty, and we have to find out how we can communicate without anybody feeling put down or criticised, etc. And we're actually letting people more into ourselves. And I wouldn't say we do that to everybody, but for those close with us, to be able to be honest. And I was saying to somebody the other day, I was just meditating on it the other day, thinking how vital this thing of honesty is. And it came to me that dishonesty is the thing that blocks us off really so much from other people. And I know for myself that most of us have wanted to put on a brave face. We wanted to look strong. We wanted to look this. We look as though we've been a success. We want to be right. But if we are able to somehow or other be honest and be honest about our fears and so on, I think we let other people in. We give them permission to be honest, and we have the potential for having relationships that really work. And it's only under the other day I suddenly thought, dishonesty comes out of our heads, because I remember, anything I say about my parents would never be a criticism. They did a great job for me. But, I just remember, what would the neighbours think? So you've got to put on a big front. What would those people think? You've got to put on a big front, and, you're going to go and get a job. Now you put on a good front and do all that. And I was thinking all the things we have done, and I want to look the best I can. I want people to think me a success. I want people to think me beautiful. I want people to think this and that. And I do all these different things to try and make myself look good. And unfortunately, so much of it is we're playing a dishonest game, because we can't really just be able to relax and be who we are. And so really valuable to really look at some of those things. And that's what we've been given life for, in my opinion. We've been given life here to explore, to try and find out what it's all about. And more importantly, I want to know who Lionel Fifield is. And that is the biggest thing, rather than who people wanted me to be, who I thought I ought to be in front of other people. I just want to be Lionel Fifield and say, look in the mirror and smile and say, hello, it's nice to know you, And one of the things I've done a lot at talks I've been in, and the thing that's just really fascinated me, that I've given talks to, models, actresses, and all sorts of things over the years. And I always love to say, how many of you in the morning get up, go into the bathroom, take your clothes off, and go, beautiful? And amongst all these beautiful models and so on, they all go, yeah. And I thought, what a screwed up society we've created. Because that body is me. That body has got intelligence in it. And if I'm going to look in the mirror and go, yeah, what am I doing? It's like going up to another person and putting them down. And, and I've realized that one of the greatest things we can do for our health and for everything is to go through and, I look at these eyes and I think, thank you for those eyes. Thank you for my ears. Thank you for my heart. Thank you for my kidneys. Thank you for all these different aspects of me. And, and often I found where I've been going through, I had a really nasty fall down a hill about 3 years ago. And I was doing something somebody said was a good way of starting a mower. And I lost my footing and dived down this hill. And I remember lying on the ground, wondering if I was a paraplegic, quadriplegic, or what I was. And I can still remember I tried moving my fingers and they moved. And then I tried moving my toes and they moved. And bit by bit, I got myself moving. And but I did like a 21 point description of what I'd been through. And I have to say, it was full of pain, full of all sorts of things, and I found so difficult, really, in a way. I couldn't walk more than about 10 meters and so on. But again, when I went to bed, I found it almost impossible to relax because of the pain in my body. But I have to say that one of the things I found so valuable is to look at myself and go into my body and just say, wherever the pain is, I go, thank you. Because the very opposite, you build up stress in your body, and the more stress, the more pain. And so, so I found that a wonderful thing to do, to go into what I want. And whenever people have said, if I've fallen over in front of people and they say, oh, gee, you'll be sore in the morning. And I always nip it in the bud and say, no, in the morning, I'll be absolutely fine, and everything will be terrific. And they'll, and I usually am. And so after about 3 or 4 months after that big fall, I started to really begin to move around, going well, and now nobody would know I'd had it. So, yeah, it's an interesting life.
I say,
It's
Lionel, can you pull
not boring.
Lionel, can you put that book that you've just written? It's called Our Partnership with Life, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the one. It's Our Partnership with Life.
And how do people who are watching the show and they want to go and get it? Yeah.
Well,
where would they go to get it, mate?
Well, they need to. Now we've closed the centre. Closed it in February. They would need. I think you advertised my email address, so you just need to get them to contact me, and we can organise it for them.
Fabulous.
That's the one there. Yeah.
Yeah. So you see it all right?
Very brilliant, mate. And has that been dispersed on a donation basis, or has the publisher put a price to it?
No, that wasn't me talking. That was me getting a printer to charge many thousands of dollars for it. But I have been pleased. It's I think we've only got a few copies left now, and I'm just thinking of getting it reprinted again. And I've had so many beautiful, beautiful letters since we closed of people saying what the centre's done for them, what a certain conversation meant. And they specifically went into things, and I thought, gee, these were so good, and how specific it was of what such and such a thing that happened for them. And I went, wow, that's going to be an interesting thing. I don't want to waste these. So, in that book, we've got little areas of space. And I said to the lady in Adelaide who's been putting all that together, I said, look, I'm sending you all these things down, and be nice on our second print if you could just put those into these spaces, because they say so much, So that's what we're aiming for. But again, you see, there I was. I mean, I can keep going on like this because I believe other people have so many of these things as well. But I had this situation where a person who'd been doing typing for me for years, she died after 34 years, and then another person took it up and then said they couldn't do any more. And I was sitting there at the beginning of about 3 years ago, thinking, I wonder what we do. And this lady who used to look after my talks in Adelaide decided to visit Brisbane for a few hours. And she came to see me and she said, how's life going with you? And she said to me when I told her, she said, I used to be a top typist for the Air Force. I used to be also in the journalist gallery in Adelaide, in Canberra. And she said, so I'm a top typist. And she said, all you got to do is now give me a call. I'll get it all typed and emailed up to you. And so from there on, all the newsletters have been put together that way. And I would just mention, and that book, and I would mention that, for over 50 years, we've been putting out these newsletters, and these are things that have up to 5 times a year, and we've been sending them out, and people write in and just say the front page articles have made so much difference that they can't wait to get the front page articles. They have all these things like, as this one says, finding freedom in vulnerability, and that's one of the things I've realised. One's got to be vulnerable to actually allow that true self of yours to come through, and the more we try and protect ourselves, the more dangerous that is. We just cut ourselves off from people.
Mm-hmm.
I think what I've found listening to your show tonight is the role of an accountant who's putting money into different columns, and the focus is on money and the balancing and checks, and throwing that all away and just allowing. I mean, there's quite a big difference between the two concepts, isn't there?
Well, I've never, in all the times that thousands of people have come to see me for personal consultations at the centre, again, I've never charged any of them. If they say, how much do I owe you for this? And I say, if you want to leave a donation, just go and talk to the person on reception and leave something there. But that's up to you entirely. And so I always knew that I could look after people who perhaps were going through very difficult times and so on. So that was, and also I should go back even when I was an accountant. I mean, I was a funny old accountant, really. I began to think how different I was, because I used to have many of them young people. They were coming in, they wanted to start companies and so on, or they would just say start a business. And about 3 of them have become international or national companies that, would be well known. And I never charged them either. I was just very, very happy to be able to sit down and talk to them. I used to love talking to them all, and to hear the excitement in them about what they're going to start, and think, oh, lovely to be part of it all. So
I'd love to ask you. You mentioned about the swimming pool with the lady. Did she turn out to be your wife?
Oh, no. Amazing. I've had a lot of experience. People say things like that to me. Well, did you marry that person? No, these people just happen to be there, who for some reason have attracted me to talk to them, and they've often led me to something which was important in the future. In fact, I'd have to tell you this, for instance. I live on 27 acres of land here, right out from Brisbane, and but on the other side of the creek there is 10 acres, which was where I first came. I can still remember this meeting this woman at a party and dancing with her, and I thought, she feels to me sad, and I can still remember at the end of that evening, I said to her, "You look at her, you're a little sad." I said, "I'd love to pick you up tomorrow, and I could drive you to wherever you'd like to go. Let's go there." And she said, "Oh, that would be wonderful." She said, "I've got to go to court about my divorce. I've got to go on Tuesday." And she said, "It'd be wonderful to have a break from all I'm thinking." So I said, "Well, it'd be lovely to do that." So anyway, I went round next day, and she said to me, "I've always loved the Sanford area." She said, "Perhaps we could have a drive out there." And I said, "Certainly. You know the way." So down we went. And as we went along, I think it was Albany Creek Road, she looked down there and she said, "Oh, if I hadn't married the man I did, I would have loved to have got that land down there." She said, "It's so beautiful." And I agreed with her. And then I said, "Well, of course, it cost a bit more. The prices are going up." And we argued about what the prices would be now. And anyway, as we got to the end of the road, there was a big sign say Golden Valley Real Estate, and he was working out of a caravan there. So we went. I said, let's sort this out, and we'll see who's right. So I went there, and this guy said, "Oh, mate, it's great to have you here because it's been such a quiet day, and I'd love to have a drive." So he said, "Hop in the car." And I said, "Now, be quite clear. We're not a couple. We're not here to buy. We just want to have a look at the prices, etc." "Yeah, mate, whatever you like." So we drove off, and he showed us this bit of land, and it was all originally paddocks for cattle and that sort of thing. So I didn't know anything more about it really, and just saw this, and he said, "Oh, the block along there has just been sold. So this is the second block in the road, and it's 10 acres, another 10 acres up here." So he said, so he told me how much it was, and it was then about $10,000. Anyhow, the week went on, and by about the Wednesday, it was an extraordinary thing. I thought I'd fallen in love. And I thought, that is extraordinary, because there's, that woman on Saturday, there's no way I felt love, anything particularly for her. She's a nice person, but that was all. I woke up on Thursday, and I knew it was that first block of land he showed me. And I knew I just had to have it. And I got on the phone, and I called this guy, and I said, "Have you sold that block of land?" He said, "No." And I said, "Don't you let anybody else have it. It's mine." And when I went on to it, I found out that we had Cedar Creek running all around it, and just absolutely beautiful little waterfalls, and just gorgeous. And so again, that's one of those things that has happened. And I wrote a little booklet about it for people, rather than telling the whole story of how these different bits of land over here came to me. And the miracle of it all, I decided I better write it down. So I didn't take up. So if a person comes here and says, "How did you get this? Is a beautiful piece of land, Lionel." And I'd say, "Oh, it certainly is." And I'd give them a copy of that, and they could go off and read it. So yeah, another one of those marvelous things that keep happening. And then of course, after 33 years, but I didn't mention this, but when, of course, we went full time and calling it the Relaxation Centre, I realised by that time we'd paid off the leasing, we'd paid off the rent, and we'd paid that lady who'd been the receptionist there for about 10 months who hadn't got any money. So anyhow, we got all that done, and I knew that's how we could now complete. And then when the others said, what are we going to do? And it just came to me, let's start a new place. And so, yeah, all these things have come together so nicely. But 33 years later, and the landlords of that place just thought we were the ants, pants, and the bee's knees, because they just couldn't do enough for us because we paid off all those debts. And yeah, I'll never forget, another 33 years on, they sold the place, and the people who'd bought it called me in and said, well, unfortunately, you're going to have to move. And I was told by 18 real estate agents that there would be nowhere at that time. Brisbane had the least amount of commercial space anywhere. And then that was a real tester for me, because people kept saying, what are you going to do, Lionel? What are you going to do? And I kept saying to them, there is a place waiting for us. I know there is a place. We will get it. And they kept saying, but everybody says there isn't anywhere. And I said, there will be a place for us. I know it's got there. And then I started having people come in and say, do you realise it's only 6 weeks before you have to move and get out of this place? What are you going to do? I said, there will be a place for us. And then on a Friday night, about 5 weeks away from the end of March, when we had to move, 5 weeks away, I get a call from a person who said, hello, mate, my name is Mark. And he said, I own a place at Audley, and perhaps we could broker a deal. And I went there, and the rent was 2.5 times what we were paying in the valley. And there were so many things that had to be done. And anyhow, I knew right through me we have to. And they said to me, we want to guarantee you for 5 years rent from you, which was like a guarantee of nearly $800,000. And I remember going around the land and all the trees I'd planted, and I said goodbye to them all. I said, I got to release everything here, and we'll see how we go. And anyhow, remarkable, one thing happened after another, and we left not owing anything, and we were there for from 2008 to 2025. So, yep, it's amazing all these journeys we go on.
Oh, fantastic. That's a wonderful sharing, really.
Well, I always was grateful. I mean, I would love to have had a wife and have a wife where I had a lovely, open, honest relationship. But I thought more and more, I was then, I think it was 68 when we got this new property, and then I had to make that guarantee. And I thought, I wonder how many women, if they'd been with me for all these years, and I said, darling, we've got to give a guarantee of 800,000. I wonder how many would say, of course, darling, why not? You would be a remarkable woman who would be in those circumstances, who would be able to just say, yep, I think we should,
Incredible. What was I going to ask you? So I have to say, like, you're 85 and you look absolutely amazing for your age. And I think now most people could knock 10 years off of their ages. People don't look as old as they used to look in the olden days, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. No, one thing has been my greatest gift, I think, and that's been my sense of humour. And as I travelled around, many people came. I always remember this one man that came up to me after a talk, and he came up and said, "Did you see that, mate? Did you see that?" And I said, "What? Did you see it?" And I said, "What?" He said, "My wife laughed." And I said, yeah, a lot of people were laughing. She said, she hasn't laughed for 20 years.
Wow.
But I have known that a sense of humour can be one of the greatest gifts we can ever have. It can just, because a person laughing can take in information in a whole new way. And the other great thing to do is tell stories. And I found that, I might go into a place years later, and the person will come and say, never forget that story you told me about so-and-so and so-and-so. Boy, oh boy, I've lived by that story ever since. It's so powerful. And, and these are the things that do make a difference. But I think when people laugh, I often say, when you're in your head, that's one thing. That's where you're stuck in your intellect and often in your open conscious mind. But when you laugh, you go right down in your belly. And when you're right down there, you're in your more intuitive level. You're in the area of just much more at home when you're there, because it's you've gone out of your head. And I used to tell a story about, I've written a book on sleep too, and it's how to get to sleep and how to stay asleep and how to get back to sleep. And I often told a story about how, because I had 14 years of chronic insomnia too, particularly starting in my teens. And I can still remember lying there, and I used to think that the woman in the next door, this is in London, the woman in the next door house used to know when I went to bed, and she'd put the dog into the back garden. And the dog would go up and down, go, wuff, 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 wuff. And I can still remember thinking, bloody dog, keeping me awake. And I started dreaming in my horrible thoughts of going to the window and throwing something out and hitting the dog and hearing go, yep, and I think, that's what I like to do. I'd like to really cause pain to that dog. And I was lying there and I was thinking, so that's not how you think, Lionel. You love animals. You love doing things with them. You've always kept animals. So wouldn't it be better to see if you can just be with that dog in your mind? And the dog would go, woof, 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 woof. And then I'd hear in the distance another dog go, woof, woof, woof. And I think, now what they were communicating. Then another dog in the distance would go, wow, 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 wow. And I think, now, I wonder if there's an actual communication going on here. This is very fascinating. And then, so I was just listening to all that. And then this little dog went, woof, woof, instead of woof, woof, woof. And I can still remember I said, oh, you've forgotten a woof, mate. Well, I mean, it's what a ridiculous thing to say. But lying in bed, I just roared with laughter. It was so funny. You've forgotten the woof. And next thing I knew, I was waking up. And so that put me on to the clue that if you can get right down into your belly like that, then you just sleep.
Mm. Yeah, and laughter is one of the greatest gifts.
It's huge, absolutely huge. And we just don't understand it for the many values it has,
Yeah. Wow. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure and delight listening to you and you sharing your story and all what you've done. So what are people doing now then, now that there's no relaxation centre? Has anybody set up anything else to start something going somewhere else?
Well, it was one of the biggest decisions. People kept saying, when you can do, I was getting into my 80s and people can say, how long can you keep doing this? I mean, I was going, many days a week and driving in and out and half an hour in, half an hour out and so on. How long can you keep doing this? And I said, I'll know when it's time. And it was interesting because I put out a newsletter and I said, I'm certain it's time to close the centre at the end of April 2025. And in November 2024, at the beginning of it, I started to put together the program for those last few months. And on Monday, I was so much pain in me. I couldn't understand why I had all this pain. And then the following Saturday, I decided to do more of that program. And then on the Monday, I was just screaming. I could sit down, and if I tried to stand up, I started screaming. And then I went to a friend who's a great masseur and really knows a lot about bodies. And I said, look, I can't lie down for you to massage me. I said, it's too much pain. And he watched me just grimace every time I tried to move. And but after about 30 minutes, I said, let's give it a try, see if I can now. With all you've done, let's see if I can lie down. Well, he then said, I've never heard a man yell and scream like you did, Lionel. That was just unbelievable. I've never heard. It was just right to your very core. And he said, I'm now going to call the ambulance and get them to take you to hospital. And they took me in, and they did all these X-rays and goodness knows what, all sorts of different tests. But in it all, I knew right through me. That was my sign not to go any further. And so I then came back and told everybody we were closing at Christmas and just going into January. And of course, for many people, it's one of the hardest things because, I have such a love for so many of the volunteers and people there. And I felt in some ways I was letting them down. How could I do this? But I was given this incredible warning. I went on to a bit of painkiller, but after I'd just really cleared my head of I had to go on, the pain just lifted and I was able to keep going. So that was an amazing experience of what my body told me.
That's a painful one.
Hey?
A painful one.
Well, the big thing is that people have heard me talk about pain and how I've dealt with it and worked with it differently from most people. And yet, so they could not believe. I still remember some faces looking at me as I was trying to get into my car, because just the whole thing of trying to get back into that seat, and I was just screaming. It seemed right at my very core was being hurt. And
wow.
So it was all amazing, and but life is amazing.
Isn't it just?
and that inner voice sometimes yells at us, and sometimes it speaks very quietly.
Amazing.
So there we are. So some of the things that happened, but I got so many letters saying, "Oh, I'm so sad. The centre is closing. I cannot tell you what the centre's done for me. It's always been there for me." And my mother, my father, my sisters, brothers, they've all been able to go there. It's changed all our lives, etc. Because you see in those newsletters, I've been able to include something like 70, 80 courses every 2 to 2.5 months, and covering such a range of things. We've had marvelous speakers, really marvelous people join me and put out stuff, and people have come out and said, wow, what a thing. I often think one of the things I've loved having there is what's called nonviolent communication, and I call it compassionate communication, started by Marshall Rosenberg. And I always remember a woman came back from America, and she came in to see me, and she said, I brought this book back for you. And now I have to tell you, I'm not much of a reader. I don't read much at all. My father used to really worry about me because he said, you'll never get on, son, if you don't read. I just didn't want to read. And although I've written all these books and articles and so on, thousands of articles, never wanted to read. And so it's been an interesting whole process. There we are. I've had all this different stuff about this I should read, and it's important for me to read. But no, it just hasn't been where I want to go to. A lot of people say, well, how did you come to start writing? It was a little interesting little story with this one, because when I was about 14, a new headmaster came to this school in London, and it was quite a famous school, Highgate, and he came to, and this new headmaster came round, and he was very much on, an aristocratic type of Englishman, and he used to walk around with a big stick all the time, and every now and again he'd give a little tap to his other arm or other hand, and one day he walked into a class I was in, and he said, "This class has been making too much noise," and he said, "You're all going to have to come back after school tonight, and we're going to put you on. You're going to have to write essays. Do you want to write? I'll come back." And anyway, he came in. He said, "You've got to write. Every one of you have got to write why school rules have to be obeyed." And well, it gave one more of those things. And I thought to myself, what a lot of nonsense this is. So anyway, I wrote this very good thing about why school rules were nonsense and they shouldn't exist. And next day, I can still remember, it was such a big thing in my life because my father was always worried about me being a failure. But next day, the head prefect arrived in the room and he said, as they did in those days, "Is Fifield here?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Could we speak?" And I went over there and he said, in the prefect's common room, we've read what you wrote. We think it's brilliant." They said, "So good." We were all laughing. They said, "Wonder if you could write for the school magazine?" And I said, "Oh, absolutely." So I went home. There I was at 14. I told my father I'd had this great success. They all wanted me to write for the school magazine. So my father looked with amazement. He said, "That's just wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. That's good." Now, the next day, somebody came in and said, "The headmaster wants to speak to Fifield." And I went, "Oh, this." So I was waiting for all these accolades to be poured upon me. And I went up, and he looked up from his desk and he said, "Are you Fifield?" And I said, "Yes." He said, if for 2 pence, he said, "I would knock you over that desk and I thrashed you until you were screaming. That was the most impudent, insolent article I've ever seen in my life." And he said, "You're just lucky to get off without being thrashed." So I went home and I said to my father, a different reaction today. But isn't that interesting? I should have been given that encouragement. And then after that, from about 18 onwards, I've written dozens and dozens and dozens of articles, and they just seem to flow out of me.
Fantastic. Well, I'd love a copy of your book, so keep one for me, and we can sort details out later.
You've got to be very special.
Oh, well, I am. If I don't say it, nobody else will.
Exactly right. No, I'm very glad. No, I'd love you to have an article, have a book. It'd be lovely. Yeah.
Well, it's been an absolute delight talking to you and with you, and I'm sure we could talk for hours about all your amazing stories. But it's come to, we have to come to a close at some point. So I just can't say thank you so much.
We just have to be careful not to let me loose too long, because I certainly can talk.
Well, thank you. It's been an absolute delight, and I've really enjoyed your sharing.
And thank you. You're the first Andrena I've ever come across.
Well, and hopefully the last.
I know. Well,
you never know.
Lovely to catch up from every now and again. And all the very best with your great show.
Thank you. Anything you want to say?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah, very good.
All the very best. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Lionel, thank you so much. Thank you, Jeffrey. And thank you to everybody that's listened in this week. And same time, same place next week. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. All the best.